As it always should. Taking a little bit longer because you met a friend to talk with or a new person to be friends with, that's a wonderful thing.
And even if you met them yesterday.
And besides, if she misses the first 5 minutes of class, she can go home and she can watch it. And she can watch herself walk in. All right, so down to work, because work is what it is. Last week we began the receiving of the Torah formally at Mount Sinai, and we had that wonderful Decalogue, the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, spiritual, moving, lofty things about the structures of society, the foundations of our worship and our connection to God, or not connecting to things that aren't God. And now we are in Parashat Mishpatim. The honeymoon's over. And by that, I don't mean to be pejorative, but if you think that being married is going to be all of the roses and the flowers and the decorations and the silks and the satins of the wedding, and that's it, then you're going to be in for a rude awakening when it comes time for you to decide who's taking out the trash, and who's cleaning the litter box, and who's unclogging the drain in the sink, and who's going to be cooking dinner this week and you next week, and oh, I've got this trip, you've got that, and who's waking up at 3 a.m. for the kid. Life and love often comes down to the details. And Parashat Mishpatim is full of details. And it's full of nitty-gritty that can sometimes seem frustratingly small-minded. But I'm hoping that we'll see that there are distinctions in some of these details which can lead us to spiritual and personal insights that go beyond merely how we would adjudicate certain cases. Speaking of that, let's see if we can make a little room. We'll pull around a chair for the end. Can someone hang a sign on the door saying that we're full?
Yeah.
That there's no more Torah available for anyone else? They'll have to wait for the recorded version.
We can split together.
I bet we could. And we would. But for today, we are comfortably full, like finishing a nice meal. All right, so let's get down to work to Parashat Mishpatim. We're going to start in chapter 21, but we're not starting at the start of chapter 21. We're going to start on verse 28. So we're chapter 21 of the book of Exodus, and we're starting on verse 28, which is page 463.
Got it. Oh.
How are we doing? Right? Chapter 21 of the book of Shemot, verse 28. How many people here own oxen? How many people here own oxen? You know, an ox. No? Really? Oh, should we skip this section then? No. Despite the unfortunate lack of oxen in all of our lives, I assume that must be unfortunate because they were awfully important in the ancient world and we don't have them. Nevertheless, we're going to study about oxen, and we're going to study about some other things which may not seem terribly appropriate to us in our modern circumstances. We will make them appropriate by the time we're done. I promise. All right, so who'd like to tell us a little bit about an ox as we start? Volunteers?
If Marion doesn't want to, I will.
Who? What?
I will.
Okay.
Want me to start? Oh, you're trying to not look at me. That's why. It's okay. Okay, I'll start. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox is not to be punished.
All right, so let's make sure we're talking distinctions here. We're talking about what are the conditions and what are the implications. We got an ox, right? Giant cow-like animal, big horns, you know.
Is that like a bull for that?
Well, a bull would be a similar type of animal, but an ox is a different actual species.
But I mean, as
They look-
dangerous?
Yes. Well, we're going to get to the whether or not there is considered perpetual danger or not.
Yeah.
In this particular case, we're talking about an animal where there was no expectation that it would be dangerous just like that. That, yeah, you'd be careful around it, but it wasn't the kind of thing that you would worry that it would just kill you at a moment's notice. It could, and it does, but there was no expectation of violence from the animal. Oxes don't go around generally hunting people. It's not quite as aggressive as we see from bulls in the cartoons, at least. Although usually the bulls in the cartoons have been provoked. Just be fair to the bulls.
Well, that's usually the excuse, yes.
Have you ever seen Bugs Bunny? I mean, I try and gore him too. So, it is an obnoxious rabbit. Funny, but obnoxious. I always felt sorry for Daffy. So the ox gores someone and kills them. What do we do with the ox? Do we say bad ox? Bad ox.
Kill it.
The ox gets killed by stoning, and despite the fact that its death is a considerable financial loss, we don't eat it. The flesh is not eaten, even though oxes in general are kosher. Not in this case. And the owner of the ox does not get punished, right? If I have a parakeet and the parakeet flies out of the house one day, flies over next door and kills someone, God forbid, I'm not responsible for that person's death.
It'd be a big parakeet.
It'd be a big parakeet. Or my parrot. If my parrot flies off and snips off someone's finger a mile down the road, I'm not responsible, says Torah, for the fact that my parrot did that.
As long as it was the first time that it ever happened, so you could not expect that that
Please
would
keep
happen.
reading.
Oh, okay.
If,
However, the ox has been in the habit of goring, and its owner, although warned, has failed to guard it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner too shall be put to death.
All right. Now, first of all, we have to make a distinction here, because we're using the word goring in two different ways, and we want to make sure we understand. Because how could an ox be in the habit of goring if the first time it gores someone to death, it gets killed? And you don't get to develop habits if you get killed after the first time. That's why you don't get a lot of habits of people skydiving without parachutes. Goring simply means to attack with the horn. You can gore somebody to death, or you can simply gore them and injure them. And in this case, we have an ox that has gored people and injured them before, but never killed them before. If, however, it does get loose, having already gored before and having the owner been warned, and the owner has been negligent in keeping it from getting free again, then the owner is considered liable for the death of the person as though he pulled the trigger himself. He knew that ox was loaded. Make sense? Question?
Yeah, going back to 28,
Mm-hmm.
might it not have been I'm using the word better, a better remedy to shecht the ox, give its meat to the family of the man or woman who died as a result of the ox? Here, you've got punishment,
No
but
compensation.
there's no
No
compensation.
compensation.
Right. So there's no compensation because there was no injustice. So we are trained as moderns to feel that if something bad has happened to us,
Somebody has.
that I deserve to be compensated.
Yeah.
But compensation in Parashat Mishpatim and the Torah as a whole only comes when there was injustice. Then the ox was bad. The ox did something horrible, therefore it needs to be killed and removed from our community. It's a danger. The same way that you might fill in a hole that someone had fallen into and gotten killed. You need to remove it from our community, but you don't deserve to be compensated just because someone died. If a rock falls from a hill and kills you, does that mean I get to take part of the mountain home and build a fireplace?
But it isn't exactly like the mountain, because a mountain, food was a little bit more, was pretty important.
Right. So the issue here is less, I think, what you're going for is compensation and more of waste.
Thank you.
Of-
If that's it.
Okay, fine, I understand why we need to remove the ox. And I understand that, we don't want to make this a party for the guy whose ox did it, that his ox gored someone, so now he gets to have a barbecue. But come on, all that meat, we're just going to waste it?
Well, but there's an idea with kosher meat, that the animals which we eat are those which are kind and gentle. We don't eat killer animals, lest it make us into that. So if this ox is a killer ox and you eat its meat, you might turn out to be like that also, so I can see why we wouldn't eat the meat. I'm still with you in favor of compensating the person, who was wronged, but it's interesting because there was no injustice.
Right.
But I
So-
can see why you would not eat the meat of that particular ox, even though in other cases it would be kosher.
Right. So this particular ox somewhat is heresy, and although the people who came up with the later layer of interpretation about the animals as being gentle and calm haven't paid much attention to the way animals actually behave. If you've ever seen two rams fighting for the right to mate, I don't think you would say that was gentle and calm behavior, but sheep are absolutely kosher.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen the
Right.
way fish eat and kill each other, I don't think we'd call fish as gentle in culture either, and yet gentle and tame, but they are among the most kosher animals, let's say the broadest category of them.
I have just turned vegan, thank you.
But-
I didn't know.
But there is a
It's the
notion.
food chain.
But it is the food chain, but there is a notion that if the ox was engaged in an evil act, that we wouldn't want to eat of it. And so it does become a waste. And since there was no feeling that the victims or victim's family needed to be compensated because there was no injustice, then there's no feeling that that would need to happen. Now what we are going to get here, though, is although we've now laid the death penalty on the owner of the ox that has done this before, is there's going to be a way out of it. So keep reading.
Okay, let's see. If ransom is laid upon him, this is the guy who
This
owns the
is
ox.
the
that
owner of
killed
the
him.
ox.
The owner of the ox. If ransom is laid upon him, he must pay whatever is laid upon him to redeem his life. So this is an owner who's been sentenced to death.
The owner's been sentenced to death because he knew that this was a dangerous ox.
Right.
It got out, it killed someone. He is now liable to be executed.
However-
now, generally in Judaism, if someone is liable for the death penalty, right? If I murder someone, there were witnesses, there was mourning, there's a trial, everything says I'm guilty, 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 I'm going to be executed, I can't buy my way out of that. Period. Judaism
Not
is,
with money,
no.
but that bloody court business once in every 400 years.
Right, so certainly Judaism has a long and varied discussion about how often the death penalty should be carried out. But of those
Right.
who agree that it can be carried out, which is the vast majority, in circumstances where it should be carried out, there is no escape. Once the court has decided and has followed all of the procedures, which are varied and difficult, and once that high bar has been passed that says capital punishment is the right punishment for this person, for this crime, you cannot write a check, no matter how big, to get out of that punishment, which is unusual, because most ancient societies had a way of buying your freedom. And that usually ended up then meaning that there was a different set of justice for the wealthy and for the poor, because the wealthy could buy their way out of crimes and the poor could not. That's if the wealthy were actually ever prosecuted in the first place. All right, so here we have a way for a person who is liable for the death penalty because of the actions of his animal to not be executed if he will pay the ransom. Keep going.
Okay, so that was an owner whose ox had gored a man or a woman. So too, if it gores a minor, male or female, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule.
Now, we generally probably would think, well, duh. Ancient world, common cultural belief was that children were not exactly property, but were an extension of a person. They were the extension of the adults. And until they were fully matured and independent, they didn't really have a lot of legal standing in their own right. And so you might have thought that if he kills a kid, well, kids die all the time. I mean, it's a sad fact of the ancient world. The child to grow into adulthood, the odds were against them generally. So my ox gored him. I mean, he could have fallen, sick to measles and smallpox and all number of other things. Come on, you can't really hold me responsible for the death of a child. That's like saying I'm responsible for the rain. No, Torah says even if it kills a child whose life is already considered tenuous at best, same penalty for that. However,
But if the ox gores a slave, male or female, he shall pay 30 shekels of silver to the master, and the ox shall be stoned.
so the ox is still killed because the slave is still considered human, but because of the slave's contingent status vis-a-vis the master, the penalty for the owner of the ox is not as severe. Now, we're not going to get bogged down in this because we discussed slavery before, and I'm sure we'll discuss it again, but that's not the main focus of our discussion today. Let's just leave it with the short teaching that Judaism feels that we are capable of handling our relationships with people now in ways that are far more beneficent and benign than the limited form of slavery that was allowed under Torah. And so slavery, even within the parameters that Torah laid out, which were restricted compared to what slavery looked like in many other parts of the world, is no longer permissible and should not be held up as the height of morality. We can do better. Okay, now we get to a couple other topics.
When a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or an ass falls into it, the one responsible for the pit must make restitution. He shall pay the price to the owner, but shall keep the dead animal.
All right, so here, well, but again, we're keeping the dead animal, an animal that dies of natural causes,
Right.
like falling into a hole.
Right.
Do you get to eat?
Maybe.
No, you don't.
No?
That's called treifa. Right? An animal that dies of natural causes, whether it be attacked by a wolf, whether it be breaking its neck, whether it be dying of a disease, is not considered kosher. However, you can feed that food of a treifa or nevela, different types of animals in these categories,
To your animal.
to your animals, like to your dogs, for example. So keeping the corpse and the skin, which also would have been helpful, would be useful, but it's not like you're going to be eating well off of this animal. So it's not exactly a bonus. You wouldn't go around laying pits to have people fall into it, because you're paying the full market value of the cow as though it was going to be eaten, and you're only recovering a small portion of that value in what you get to use it for.
Right.
We get that distinction? Okay? But why wouldn't I just say, hey, you should have kept better track of your
Oh,
cow?
right.
Right? My pit,
Yeah.
your cow, why am I the one to blame? Your cow broke my pit.
She didn't cover it. It's a nuisance.
But aren't you supposed to keep your cow behind a fence? You don't just let it wander every place it wants. It might gore somebody.
Right, so the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud will begin to investigate the gradations of where was the pit and where was the ox and all of these things. But the basic rule is the person who introduces a unmitigated danger in an area where it can be felt is responsible for the outcomes of that danger.
That's like having a swimming pool without a fence.
Oh, right.
Do that.
Like having a
That's
swimming
right.
pool without a fence.
Even if the kid breaks into your lanai area
Right.
and pushes up to the swimming pool and falls in, if you don't have a fence around it,
Yeah.
you're screwed.
Yeah. You are responsible, I think was the word you were
Yes.
looking for. I don't think everyone speaks the Latin that you use. The word you were looking for was responsible.
Yes.
Not at all, not at all. Similarly,
When a man's ox injures his neighbor's ox,
this
and
is
it dies,
animal versus animal.
and his neighbor's ox dies, they shall sell the live ox and divide its price.
That's the attacking ox, right? The one that's still alive is the one that attacked. They sell it and they split the proceeds.
And they also divide the dead animal. If, however, it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring and its owner has failed to guard it, he must restore ox for ox, but shall keep the dead animal.
So you keep the carcass, but you have to make good a complete replacement for the dead animal. And by the way, ox for ox, as we see later on in Leviticus more explicitly, we're not talking about necessarily I've got to give you an identical ox. Cloning had not been invented, but that meant monetary restitution for the precise value of the animal that had been killed. How are we doing so far?
Are these laws totally new for the day? Like if these incidents were to happen in Egypt or Mesopotamia, like would there be a totally different set of rules?
Yes and no. Let's get one more set of rules down, and then we'll talk about that broadly, and then we'll talk about how our tradition views them. Because it's the perfect segue, one paragraph too early.
When a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep.
All right, and then we go on to talk a little bit more about stealing, but looking at the clock, we're going to go ahead and leave it there for our compensation. So you steal an ox or a sheep, you have to pay 5 times the value of the ox and 4 times the value of the sheep. What, just nodding about this?
Well, but that's not an accident, that's a willful act
No, no,
to
no.
go and steal it.
And the difference between an ox and a sheep?
5 and 4.
If you
Oh.
steal a Toyota, you have to pay for 4 Toyotas. If you steal
Right,
a BMW, you have to pay for 5 BMWs. Ma?
What happens to the thief?
And what happens to the thief? We just found out what happens to the thief. The thief pays the penalty. The notion of incarceration as a form of punishment, as opposed to merely holding someone for trial, is totally foreign to the ancient world. And was foreign in the American legal system as well. The initial forms of incarceration were not meant to punish, they were meant to rehabilitate. It was only later that people began to think, well, you know, rehabilitation's not working, but it's still nice to just lock them up as a punishment, so we'll keep it with that. And it was decided that was more humane than the previous forms of either penalties, which would create indentured servitude as you paid off a debt, garnishing the wages in the modern sense, or corporal punishment, of flogging someone for having done something that was wrong. So to come back to Howie's question of how radical were these notions compared to other ancient law codes, the answer is very and not at all. So there was already a notion in every ancient culture that you had to have certain principles and standards for what to do when someone's property damaged your property. That was kind of a common occurrence, not necessarily daily, but it came up often enough that you had to make sure that you had rules that you could resolve this without resorting to bloodshed. Or your ox killed my brother, so now I'm going to murder you and your family, was not something that most societies wanted to have happen. They wanted to find a way to temper the anger or the frustration that could come out of any of these, especially the issues of murder, but also the issues of just your own property being destroyed. You know, my ox, I plow with that ox. Your ox kills my ox, I can't plant my food. I can't plant my food, I'll starve to death, thank you very much. So I need to be compensated. And so who gets what and how the compensation works was important in all of the different places. But what we see is that the notion in the very last verse that I didn't lose a limb for stealing. That's unusual because many of the ancient law codes, in fact, the vast majority of them, had not only corporal punishment involved, but usually maiming punishment involved for theft. That if you had gone and stolen my cow, then you would lose a hand. And indeed, up until the 20th century in many parts of America, what was the penalty for cattle rustling?
Death.
Hanging.
Right? How many people have seen those old Western movies? What do you do with cattle rustlers? You hang them. And who needs a trial, right? That's what lynch mobs are for. It's the ready-made justice. And if someone had hung a cattle rustler for stealing their cows, the court would not have come after them. They would have said that was entirely justified. And that was true up until the 20th century in America. And it has not been true for 3,500 years in Judaism. A thief would never be punished by killing for having stolen or by maiming for having stolen. But we're still left with these distinctions between cows and sheep, which seem a little odd. Yes?
The ox was a farm animal, used for cultivating. The sheep, you shear once a year. You can only eat them once.
Right.
Where the ox was daily, you use daily for plowing or planting.
Right. So certainly, because oxes had utility beyond just their breeding capacity and their wool or hair, skin, they would be worth more. But wouldn't their greater value be reflected in the multiplication? Right. I mean, to use my example before, if I say the Toyota was worth 20,000 and I say the BMW was worth 50,000, if I times both of them by 4, for my payment, then I'm paying 80,000 and I'm paying 200,000. Thank you. That's why I'm not an accountant.
Any of the reasons.
I've already made a huge distinction in my penalty, even if I use the same times 4 for both of them. So why throw an extra fifth in for one category of thing that's been stolen? What in the world is going on here? Let's hold off on a few more speculations as we'll go through this topic as well as a little detour in the process as we try and
Do that.
pull apart some distinctions. Because Torah and living a life of mitzvot hinges upon our ability to see the distinctions. Right? God did not paint with finger paints. When God wanted to draw a picture of a just society, he gave us details. He gave us specifics. Maybe not all the specifics we might have wanted. That's why the Mishnah and the Talmud and rabbis have been employed ever since. But he gave us enough granularity that we would do better than just saying stealing's bad, or saying if you're responsible for your animals. There's more detail to it than that to give us more of an understanding of how to handle the details of justice. We okay on our handouts? I apologize for our printer. We are getting a new one. Okay. So, who'd like to start us off with a little Mishnah from Bava Kama? Oh, Marion, thank you.
More encompassing is the rule covering payment of twofold restitution than the rule covering payment of fourfold or fivefold restitution. For the rule covering twofold restitution applies to something whether animate or inanimate. But the rule covering fourfold or fivefold restitution applies only to an ox or a sheep alone, since it says, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep.
Okay, so what we've just been introduced here, and it's based on another passage in the Torah, but the Mishnah is summarizing it for us, is that we have 3 categories of things in the world that someone might steal. Someone might steal an ox, someone might steal a sheep, and someone might steal anything else. Right? You know, there's 2 types of people in the world. Well, there's 3 types of things you might steal in the world: an ox, a sheep, and everything else in the world. That's how it breaks down. Slightly smaller categories than the anything else category. And the penalty is times 5, times 4, times 2. Based on our passage here. But for sheep and ox, we've got this extra multiple, and for everything else, we've simply got a double penalty.
Yeah.
Why?
Why?
Why make the distinction? What's that root here? What am I doing when I pay the penalty in the first place?
The importance of the object. So if they stole cash, you know, that's not as bad as an ox that the person needs in order to survive.
So if the principle is that there is an intrinsic necessity of the ox, does that mean that since I don't have any oxes now, but let's say I was a pizza delivery driver, I need my car to survive, would that move my car from this category to this category? If I'm a pilot and I need my plane, and someone steals my plane. If I'm a farmer, someone steals my tractor. So if we rest our underlying principle on the utility of the item, then actually all of that falls apart. Because then we're saying it's useful, sorta, not. Which is not what the Mishnah said. And apparently, at least from our rabbis and sages' understanding, not how we should apply it. That the categories were not about utility, they were something else that still holds for 542, but is not readily apparent.
So it's something having to do with the sacred nature of the ox and the sheep as a sacrificial animal?
Well, they were certainly eligible for sacrifice, but
And
so
anything else wasn't?
so are turtle doves, so is grain, so is water, for that matter. And certainly they weren't sacred in the sense that we worship them. You know, that whole golden cow thing. Yeah, we try to
That's why
forget.
everything's with ox.
Exactly. Right. We don't want to talk about the cows. Judy, did you want to?
I noticed that it says if a man steals the ox or sheep and kills it or sells it,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't get to read ahead to the end of the paragraph, where it says, if what he stole is found alive in his possession, he shall pay double.
Correct. That's where the Mishnah gets the rest of
Yeah.
it.
Oh, the trouble.
Yeah. If you haven't disposed of it, then you just return it plus a penalty of its value. That's the times 2 category.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if that has anything to do with why there's a distinction of paying more if you've already killed it or sold it.
That's a good question. But see, these distinctions are built into the Torah, so we must, by assumption, assume that these distinctions are important. So in order to try and get us in the right frame of mind, I want us to look at a different passage. It's related but very tangentially, so please bear with me, but it's one I've wanted to share. So, so you get what I want to teach sometimes, which also deals with another distinction which hopefully can at least begin to see how we can think about distinctions that don't look like they have any difference, but underlying them can make a difference. Because distinctions without differences aren't that interesting. But sometimes there are distinctions that have differences which are not apparent. Okay, so Marion, you going to keep reading for me?
If he slaughtered a wild beast or a bird, and he did not cover up its blood, and another person saw him, the other person is obligated to cover up.
Okay, so probably most of you here are not trappers, and so you've never had to shecht a wild animal, kosher wild animal. But one of the mitzvot that goes along with that type of kosher slaughter is that when the blood comes out, you have to cover it up with dirt. You have to cover over the dirt, cover over the blood that gets poured out from the shechting. That's one of the mitzvahs mentioned in Leviticus. Keep going. But so in this case, if I catch a deer and then I slaughter it and the blood pours out and then I leave and I did not cover over the dirt, if someone or the blood, if someone else sees it, they should come over and cover it up. They don't say, "Oh, look at that guy who didn't cover the blood. Terrible sinner." They say, "Ah, look at that guy who didn't cover over that blood. Terrible sinner. I'll do it." It's the "I'll do it" that's important.
If he covered up and it became uncovered, he is free of liability to cover it up.
If you cover it up and for whatever reason the dirt moves again, gets pushed off, disturbed, and the blood is now exposed, you did your job. You don't need to stand watch over it for days and days and days to make sure it stays covered.
If the wind covered it up and it became uncovered, he's liable to cover it up.
Yeah, so the wind blows dirt, it covers it over. Remember, we're also talking about small birds here, so we're not talking about puddles of blood from a giant deer. Just a little blood from a bird, and the wind blows the dirt over it. Well, it's covered, but if the wind blows the dirt off of it and now it's uncovered, since you never actually covered it in the first place, you do have to cover it in the second place if the wind uncovers it after having covered it first. So you're off the hook if you covered it in the first place and it becomes uncovered, but if you didn't cover it in the first place when it got covered by some other force, and then it gets uncovered, well, you're still on the hook because you never did your job in the first place. We following this? Okay. Now we're going to get to a very, one more little side, and then we're going to get to a very interesting case.
With what he poured it out, he should cover it. He should not cover it by kicking dust on it with his foot, for he should not subject the commandments to derision.
All right, so you might think that you got a little dove, right? And I've caught it in my net, and I take it and I shecht it, and the blood pours out. It's pouring out. I'm here. Ground's there. I need to cover the blood. Most natural thing in the world would be to, right, just push some dirt over it. No. Why not? Not because you wouldn't be fulfilling the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah itself is to cover it. But because by doing so,
That way.
this is not a way to do a mitzvah. Right, this is doing a mitzvah in a very just sort of derisive, offhand, just nasty kind of way. You're not showing the mitzvah itself proper respect. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay, I'm getting some nods. Now let's see what we deal with the next case.
Once a person slaughtered, and another went ahead and covered the blood. And Rabban Gamaliel declared the one who covered obligated to give him 10 gold coins.
What? So wait, I slaughter the animal, and someone else runs in before I can and covers over the blood. I take him to court, and I win, and he has to pay me 10 gold coins?
That makes sense.
That makes sense?
That makes sense.
Shouldn't we rush to do this vote?
Well, he did rush to do mitzvot. Why should he be penalized?
But it's your mitzvah to do.
He prevented you from doing
He
it.
usurped your opportunity.
He stole a mitzvah from me. He stole a mitzvah from me. But did he steal the mitzvah? Or did he steal the bracha? Because when you do this for the slaughtering of an animal, there's a bracha to say. So is he being penalized because he stole the mitzvah? Or is he being penalized because he stole the opportunity to do the bracha? That's what the Gemara is about to ask.
Was this compensation for depriving him of performing a commandment or of reciting a blessing?
Right? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, and that's exactly what the Talmud's going to ask, no? What's the difference? If the fact that he did it instead of me means that he has to pay 10 gold coins, who cares if it's because he stole the commandment from me or because he stole the mitzvah from me? Because he stole the blessing from me. It's the same. 10 coins, we're done, I put it in my pocket, we leave, court adjourned. I don't need the long explanation of why this happened.
Make it a more anyway, because if he stole the mitzvah by definition, he stole the blessing, because you have to say, well, it is.
Right, so exactly. I mean, why should there be even more? It's all one bundle of activity. How can you separate them out?
In what case is there a practical difference in reciting the blessing over the meal?
The Birkat Hamazon.
If you say it is compensation for the performance of a commandment, then counts as
Sorry,
one.
then it counts.
Then it counts as one. But if you say that it is compensation for the recitation of a blessing, then here there are four. Which is it?
Which is it then? Okay, so Birkat Hamazon. How many mitzvahs do we fulfill when we do Birkat Hamazon? One. There's one mitzvah in the Torah which says that after you've eaten, you should bless. Very good. How many actual blessings are in Birkat Hamazon? How many times do we say Baruch Atah? 4 times in the current form. It's been added to up until the early 2nd century. But for the last 1,800 years, there have been 4 blessings in Birkat Hamazon. So, if I'm getting paid 10 gold coins for having had a commandment stolen, if someone steals my right to do Birkat Hamazon, they get 10 coins. If I'm getting paid 10 gold coins because my blessing was stolen, then if they steal my right to do Birkat Hamazon, I should get 40 coins. Because 4 times 10. Right? If we're counting commandments, I get paid 10 per commandment usurpation. If we're counting brachot, blessings, then I should get paid 10 coins per blessing that has been usurped. You see the logic there? So there is a practical distinction, because some mitzvot have more than one blessing. Okay, let's see if we can actually find proof for this.
Come and take note. A certain Sadducee said to Rabbi.
The Sadducees were a rival sect in the ancient world, and Sadducee generally is considered to be a stand-in word in the Talmud for a whole variety of heretics, of people that were antithetical to rabbinic and classical Judaism. Sometimes they were a stand-in for actual Sadducees, although by the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, which is who we mean when we say Rabbi, there weren't a lot of actual Sadducees left. Sometimes they were some of the early Christian groups. But it was generally considered healthier when you were printing copies of the Talmud not to write early Christian in your word, because that got the Christian people that we lived among very angry, and then they'd burn the Talmud or censor it as they did in other places. So Sadducee was a safe code word for a whole variety of heretics and people that were aggressively against Judaism. Although in this particular case, it does not seem like it would have been an early Christian based upon the objection he raises.
The one who formed the mountains did not create the winds, and the one who created the winds did not form the mountains.
All right, so he's arguing there's more than one deity. There's this heretic is saying there's something that made mountains and something that made winds, and I'll prove it to you from your own texts. Keep going.
For it is written, lo, he who forms the mountains and creates the winds.
All right, now in the English translation, it looks like it's all one nice long sentence, but the way Hebrew works, it could easily be read, wrongly and stupidly, as we're going to see, that, lo, he creates the mountains, he creates the winds. You could read it that way. It's a bit of a stretch, and the heretic in here is being set up as an idiot. But that's the proposition that's being put forward to Rabbi, is that, look, even Amos, the book of Amos, proves that your slavish obligation to worship only one God must be wrong. And of course, Rabbi rebuts.
Fool, look at the end of the verse. The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name.
As often happens when people bring up criticisms of Torah or Judaism, they are selectively quoting. And if you go to the end of verse 14 of chapter 4 in the book of Amos, it names who it was that is being referred to in this litany of activities as being God. So, duh. It's like, that argument only works, A, if you stretch the Hebrew, and B, don't bother finishing the verse. That if you notice all of the details of a verse, you wouldn't come to that conclusion.
He said to him, give me 3 days, and I will return with a decisive refutation.
All right, so the heretic says, all right, it's good point. I'll be back in 3 days, and I'll prove to you why I'm right. And he walks off, trying to figure it out. You got the scene? Okay.
The rabbi sat and fasted for 3 days.
He's worried about what's going to happen. He's praying for strength and for support that this is, not going to continue to be a problem. And in different cases, in different parts of our history, the attacks of heretics or people who were just antithetical to Judaism would often become attacks on Jews. It wasn't just enough for them to try and defeat us in disputations. Often, whether we won or lost, there would be repercussions, depending upon how closely allied they were to the ruling powers. So this was dangerous, even though there is no refutation. I mean, there is no thing that this heretic's possibly going to say that's going to make Rabbi look wrong. Rabbi's still nervous about the situation. It's a tense time. We all got that? Yes? Good?
When he was about to eat, they said to him, the Sadducees at the gate. He said, they gave me poison for food.
All right, he quotes. It would be probably more accurate in modern vernacular. He quotes from the book of Psalms, they gave me poison for food. Wonderfully obtuse, yes? What's he saying?
No idea.
Anyone ever sat down for dinner and all of a sudden the telemarketer's call? Okay? He finally, after 3 days, is sitting down to eat when there's a Sadducee at the door, and he's thinking, really? I finally sit down to eat, and this guy shows up now. You're ruining my dinner. You're giving me poison to eat. Rather than me getting to eat, you're giving me this? You're giving me another Sadducee? It's frustration. He's exasperated with the situation. It's nice to see a little bit of the humanity of the rabbis and little quips like this. Just, please, really? I just sat down.
He said to him, Rabbi, I bring you good tidings. The other one could not find an answer, and he threw himself off the roof and died.
Hooray! Yeah, so this is a different Sadducee,
Yes.
or different heretic, who comes to Rabbi and says, guess what? The other guy who was here realized that he had no way to answer you, so he committed suicide. Let's all celebrate. Which, in a sense, is good news that he gave up. It's not so good that he killed himself, but this Sadducee has come around then to the rabbinic view. He is recognizing the error of his ways, and he is willing to concede the victory to Rabbi and to rejoin the normative Jewish community, let's say.
He said to him,
Remember, we're all still trying to figure out whether it's for the mitzvah or for the blessings. That's this whole diversion.
He said to him, do you wish to dine with me? He said to him, yes.
That's to say, Rabbi invites him to stay for dinner. Well, now that you're here and now that we're friends again, come and eat.
After they ate and drank, he said to him, would you prefer to drink the cup
Of the blessing,
of
sorry.
the blessings?
My typo.
Or would you rather have 40 gold coins?
All right, so the cup of the blessings is the cup of wine that is often used for Birkat Hamazon. So by offering someone the cup of blessings, it was the jargon in rabbinic times, it meant, would you like to lead Birkat Hamazon? Would you like to lead Birkat HaMazon, or would you rather have what's behind door number 3, 40 gold coins?
What right did he have to offer that?
What rank did
What
the
rank?
Rabbi?
What right did he have to offer gold coins at a time when you're supposed to recite Birkat HaMazon?
The right of testing someone.
He didn't really mean it.
Rabbi?
He was gonna,
No,
he
he
was
was,
No,
gonna
but-
they
mention later.
wanted to see what the answer.
Yeah, but this is Rabbi. I mean, this is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi to the former heretic,
Right?
saying, okay, let's see whether you really are on our team now. I'll give you a choice. Would you rather have the chance to do these blessings, or would you rather have cash in the hand? If he had continued to be a heretic, if he continued to dispute the idea that there is only one God, if he continued to refute the idea that there are blessings and that this is a good thing, he'd take the money. And then Rabbi would just, would just say, okay, here's your money, leave, and then do Birkat HaMazon on his own. It wasn't that if he, would not do Birkat HaMazon, but he wanted to see where this person's heart really lay now that this whole disputation was done. Did he really get it? Did he really understand? So he was offering him a choice. Do Birkat HaMazon, lead it, and therefore do the blessings, or have 40 gold coins in cash.
He said to him, I would rather drink the cup over which one recites the blessings. A heavenly echo went forth from her flame. The cup of wine over which one recites the blessings is worth 40 gold coins.
Okay, so he gets the cup, and he gets to keep it for the money. So he gets both. So he gets to do the blessings, and he gets to pocket the cash in the form of the cup. Now, it's not normal, by the way, when you come to my house, don't expect it. It's not normal to walk off with the cup, but special circumstances here. Special circumstances. So, to come back to our original question about the one who stole the right to cover over the blood, did he have to pay 10 gold coins because he stole the right to do the commandment, or because he stole the bracha? The bracha. How do we know that? Because what is the cup of blessings at the end of Birkat HaMazon worth? 40. Why? Because there are 4 blessings in it, 10 gold coins per blessing, as we had talked about before. Everyone follow that? It's a bit of a maze, yes? Or maybe amazing. Well, we'll see. The idea that I'm trying to get across here, before we return to our stolen objects, is that looking into the details of how a verse is written or of how things are adjudicated is part of what it means to be in love with Torah. That to just recite the surface level or just recite the paraphrased platitudes of don't steal, be nice, and that kind of thing isn't enough. If you're going to be in love with Torah, if you're going to live a full and active Jewish life, God is in the details. And you got to dig down. And sometimes it ain't going to be easy. Sometimes you're going to end up arguing an awful lot, which is good, healthy. But it means that you're going to have to work to get all of the value out of these commandments that is there in them. It's the equivalent of if someone gives you a parcel of land and says, here, I'm giving you 40 acres. That land is worth nothing unless you actually go out and work it and use it. You plow it and grow from it, and now you will have produce every year. You build a house on it, and now you have a place to live. Right? You build a school on it, you have a contribution to the community. So just the surface isn't enough. You got to use it, you got to work it, you got to sweat over it. So let's go back to our stolen cows or stolen oxes, sheep, and other things, and see how our sages sweat a little bit to work this out. So we are on the third to last paragraph. We're going to get 3 explanations.
Said Rabbi Meir, come and reflect on how beloved is hard work before him who merely by speaking brought the world into being. For an ox, because the thief has kept it away from its work for the farmer, the thief pays 5-fold compensation. For a sheep which does no labor for the owner, the thief pays fourfold compensation.
All right, now let's make sure we understand the details of what Rabbi Meir is trying to tease out of this 5-4 distinction. What was special about the ox that meant fivefold compensation? It works, therefore?
Therefore, he's more important.
No.
More necessary.
No. And that's this gradation that I'm trying to tease out here. Rabbi Meir isn't saying that the ox is more important to the farmer. He's saying the ox is more important to itself and to God. Because the ox works. The ox itself has greater worth in God's sight because it works. And the sheep doesn't. The sheep walks in the field, eats, and just sits around. Everything good from a sheep comes from the work of others. The sheep itself doesn't work any harder than filling its belly. That's it.
It says here,
Mm-hmm.
the thief has kept it away from its work for the farmer.
Exactly. It couldn't work.
Right.
Not that the farmer lost out. It couldn't work. Look at how beloved is hard work. Even an ox, which only works because the farmer makes it work, is considered more valuable because it works.
For,
I know, a word.
Because it does
the-
something,
but
yes.
Right, the ox does work.
Right.
And it benefits the farmer. The sheep may do work in trying to find the grass and eat it and stuff, but
Right.
that work doesn't benefit anybody, it's just for the sheep himself.
The sheep would
Whereas
do it
the
whether there
ox's
was an
work
owner or
benefits
not.
the farmer.
It's
So
saying
we-
that the intrinsic value of work is what's being compensated here, not the lost labor value. But it's acknowledging the greater worthiness that something that works and contributes to others around it, to its society, even for itself, is noble. And that deserves greater compensation.
But you raised a good point too. But an additional good point, that if the ox were not, it would have lived, it wouldn't be working. It would be doing the same thing the sheep did.
Correct. Which is why this is
So
less of
it's
it.
more noble inherently
Ah.
or intrinsically.
Which is why this is less of a teaching about the animal instincts and more of a teaching about what Judaism values from us as humans. So you take this teaching, which is drawn from the 5-4 distinction, and you apply it to our own activities. And say, look at how much God values our work, our labor. I should want to work. I should choose to work.
Even if I don't want to.
Even if I don't want to, because in the sight of God, this ox is valued, even though it's whipped, even though it's being pushed through, for its work more than the sheep. How much more so should I value work?
So that means retired people are in trouble
You mean you don't work?
in the eyes of God.
Well, again, work in the classical definition does not always mean drawing a salary. The ox certainly didn't.
Volunteer work, yes.
But it does mean that to retire to a life of the lazy boy and TV, and that's it, is definitely questionable in the eyes of the sages, in the eyes of Torah. That there's work that can be done that is not as rigorous, exhausting, or difficult, depending upon an age or the body's condition, that is still noble and ennobling, and that we should seek it out. Again, we don't have to work ourselves to death until the moment we die in the sense of being driven like a slave. But we do need to continue to labor in some capacity or another. And I think that most modern psychologists agree with that when it comes to retirement, that sitting on a lazy boy is not a recipe for a long life.
I think the examples in the priesthood where they were required to retire at 50,
From the public duties, yes.
but they had to be tutors to the priests coming up.
Right, they still had work to do, even if it wasn't the heavy labor that was involved in the original, the primary sacrifices.
What's the significance of the 5? I know you referred to it before,
Mhm.
but it's only one more than the 4?
Mm-hmm.
And why isn't it double the 4?
Okay, so there also comes to be a certain point where you say, and we may not know all of it. So this is why we talk about chukim and mishpatim. that there are laws and ordinances which we try to examine and dig as deep as we can, but at some point, the hole gets too deep and the labor is too hard, or our arms are simply inadequate for digging further, and each eventually will stop and say, up till here I can understand, beyond here I'm thankful that God gave it to us, because I would not have been able to get further to realize it for myself. That's where revelation kicks in, and our capacity to sit back and wonder at God's perfection in Torah kicks in, rather than simply saying, well, it must not make any sense because I don't understand it, as if my intellect was the measure of God's. We simply say, I am obligated to try and labor and uncover as much as I can. And the 5-4 split, people have hypothesized, but we don't have a perfect explanation.
But there has to be a practical limit on compensation.
Some
if
limit,
you make
yes.
the ox 8 times, that becomes such a burden for the person that, you know,
Mhm.
who has to pay back that 8 times. It's just too high a number.
Indeed, there has to be some limit, and indeed in this and many other cases as well, our sages point out that the rational person might be able to deduce that thieves should have to pay a penalty when they compensate their victim. The precise level of penalty, reason may not be able to come to a perfect answer, which is why we're thankful for revelation, for providing us with insights that we could not achieve through the human capacity to reason, which is something that we're uncomfortable with, I know, in the modern world. We don't like to think that there are limits to what we can understand, but guess what? All right, we got a couple more interpretations of the 4-5 split that can give us a little bit more personal insight.
Said Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, come and reflect on how the
Omnipresent.
omnipresent takes pity for the honor owing to humanity. For an ox, because it goes along on its own feet, the thief has to pay 5-fold compensation. For a sheep, which the thief has to carry upon his shoulder, the thief pays only 4-fold compensation.
All right. Don't get that one? That's because you're not concerned about the honor of the thief. The dignity of the thief doesn't matter in American legal courts. And in most of our pop culture, we just want to penalize them. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, look, if you steal a cow, or an ox, right? You just put a leash around its neck and you walk. And you're just a guy walking with an ox. To steal a sheep, you got to pick it up and carry it. And that's more humiliating. That's more humiliating. That even a thief deserves to be recognized as being deserving of kavod habriot, the honor of humanity, the dignity of being human. And if he had to decrease his dignity in order to do this, then he's already been penalized some in the very act that he undertook, even though it was illegal. I know, it's not the way we normally think in the modern world, is it? It's throw the book at them. The idea that someone who is stealing has lost part of their dignity doesn't even enter into our minds. You know, someone that is stealing from the trash, we consider to be just as guilty as someone who is stealing through financial chicanery. Oftentimes more guilty, depending upon how they're being prosecuted. But Judaism is saying, no, if you have to humiliate yourself further, that should be considered as part of the punishment you've already gone through in committing this act. Yeah, it's a different way of looking at the world. That's why I'm saying the details matter.
Does the Talmud care if the thief is starving, the family is starving,
Absolutely.
versus, just doing it
For fun and profit?
Yeah.
Yes. It doesn't excuse the person in the sense that they still have stolen, but the community response is meant to be very, very different in those circumstances. And the community feeling of shame is much greater. When we talk about the case of the the Egel Arufah, the calf with the broken neck, the situation that's described where a body is found in the middle of nowhere, out in a field, and the towns have to be measured to see who's closest to it, and they have to come out and bring this cow, and they break the neck over the body, and they say, we didn't shed this blood. The sages say that the reason they say we didn't shed this blood is twofold, and there's a bit of an argument, but they both are very poignant. One is to say, this was not a traveler who came through our towns, who left without proper support, and therefore died in the wilderness because we didn't help him. Or two, this wasn't a traveler who came through our town, who left without proper support, and who turned to robbery, and who was killed by his victim, and therefore we should feel guilty that he died. Now, why should I feel guilty that he chose to become a robber, and his victim killed him? Yashar koach for self-defense. Sure, Judaism does believe very strongly in self-defense and would not hold the victim who saved his life at the expense of another as being guilty. But the people who put someone in a position where that became the only choice that they could now envision, should feel some sense of remorse for having created that circumstance, or at least contributed to it. We don't enter into that into American legal system because our American legal system generally views things very mechanistically. And we don't like to see ourselves as being, Torah says, which is creating justice so we create a just community. We create justice in American courts so that we know who to punish and who not to punish. And whether or not it creates a better community or not is a complete ancillary question for the way we currently run justice. But for Torah, it's primary. And we should not look at the criminal as being the bad guy. It's someone who's among us who has done something wrong, which needs to be punished, but in appropriate ways to the wrong they have done and to the way that situation arose. Because our obligation is not to find the perfect punishment, our obligation is to create justice. And justice goes beyond just the punishment phase. One more. Just in case you think that the Torah is too soft on thieves and robbers.
Said Rabbi Nahai, they have presented the following parable in the name of Rabban Gamaliel. To what are the thief and the robber comparable? To two people who lived in the same town and made parties. One invited the townsfolk, but not the royal family. The other, neither the townsfolk nor the royal family. Who is subject to the more severe reprisal? It is the one who invited the townsfolk, but not the royal family.
All right, so thief and robbers are considered different in the sense that a thief steals by stealth, and a robber steals in the daylight. This is something that will come in the next few paragraphs if you keep reading your Torah from where we had to stop. Who is worse? Who's worse in terms of like the moral and theological implications of their actions? The person who says, give me your money, or the person who steals it secretly?
The secret one.
According to Rabbi Meir, the secret one. Now we would say, you threatened a person. How? That's sorry. No, we're back. You threaten a person is the one who is not afraid of the people. Sorry. Let me make sure I got this right. Confused myself there for a second. The issue is here, are we afraid of people, or are we afraid of God? Or are we afraid of both? The one in secret, thank you, we're back on track here, stole in secret because they were afraid of people, but they're not afraid of God. The one who stole in plain sight, the robber, is not afraid of people or God. So the invitation thing, you have to do kind of a little bit of a flip. Inviting means you don't mind who gets upset. So if you invite the townspeople but not the king, it means you don't want the town to get upset, but you don't care what the king thinks. Whereas if you don't invite the town and you don't invite the king, it means you don't care about the town and you don't care about the king. Little too complicated at the end of the lesson?
Isn't that worse?
No. Because how dare we say that we're more afraid of people than we are of God? At least if I try to hide it from you, if I don't care about you and I don't care about God, at least I'm putting humans and God on the same disrespect level. But if I'm afraid of you but not afraid of God, what does that say about my feelings about God? Right? You know, it's the old joke, you know, God will understand, the neighbors I'm not so sure about. Right? But in reverse, the neighbors wouldn't understand, so I'll hide it from them. But who cares what God thinks? You know, to sin in secret because you're afraid of what other people would say is, yes, less violent, and that is a positive thing, but theologically, it's a much more offensive act. Roll that through your mind. And keep looking at the details. There's going to be a whole bunch of different little verses with all sorts of details of all sorts of things that don't sound like they relate to anything we do today. Try and pull them apart. Try and consider them. I can't guarantee that you'll get great answers right away, but you're not going to get anything unless you actually turn the soil. Yes?
Since the Torah is supposed to be our leader,
Mm-hmm.
how did America come up with their justice system? Because their system is really very injustice to one type of people and
yeah.
other people.
How did America, if America was founded on so-called Judeo-Christian values, how did we end up with the justice system we have is a much, much longer conversation. But it had to do with the fact that the people who were making the rules initially made the rules generally to be what they thought was right without worrying about whether what they thought was right actually matched the details of the books that they said that they believed in. And that's a very common problem for people both great and small. Most of us believe that what we do day to day is what God wants, because we've never stopped to question whether what we did is really what God wants, or stop to question the text to figure out what we think God actually wants. We live with a happy, hazy assumption. And the people who have written our laws for most of the last few hundred years were certainly happy and hazy, and were willing to leave things that in hindsight, or even at the time, with an unclouded view, would have been seen as unjust on the books because it seemed okay to them. Yeah, it's a blemish, to say the least, and one to go into more detail that would require more time than we have today. But that's the general flaw in thinking. We rationalize things to ourselves all the time, and when we do that, when we're in power, the repercussions are extreme. Thank you very much.
Thank you.